The promise of love is a fragile thing, a petal of hope offered in an open palm. To have it crushed is one kind of pain, to have it laughed at is another entirely. Elara learned this in the gilded heart of the court of eternal night, under the weight of 1,000 crystal pendants that dripped light like frozen tears. She had stood before him, King Kashan, the monarch of shadow and silence, and offered him the only true thing she owned, her heart. And he had laughed. It began on the night of the blood moon solstice, a celebration that bled crimson and silver across the obsidian halls of the onyx spire. The air, usually cool with the scent of ancient stone and dormant magic, was thick with the perfumes of mortal guests, a heady, intoxicating mix of fear and desire, and the richer, metallic tang of spiced wine that flowed from fountains carved in the likeness of weeping gargoyles. Elara, a ward of the court, a political bargain from a sunlit kingdom long since faded into memory, was a creature of beige and brown in a world of jewel tones. She was a scholar, a keeper of records, her hands more accustomed to the dusty velvet of old books than the cold silk of courtly gowns. But tonight, she wore blue, the color of a twilight sky just before the first star appears, a borrowed courage woven into the fabric. For 3 years, she had watched him. Kashan was not a king of bombast or cruel spectacle. His power was in his stillness. He could command a room with a glance, quell a rebellion with a single, softly spoken word. He moved with a grace that belied his age, an age measured not in years but in epochs. She saw past the immortal predator, the political titan. She saw the loneliness in the way he stood on the highest balcony, a solitary silhouette against the bruised purple of the perpetual twilight. She saw the weariness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking, a profound exhaustion that came from witnessing civilizations rise and crumble like sandcastles before an indifferent tide. She had read his history in the royal archives, the wars, the betrayals, the loves lost to the unforgiving march of mortal time. And in her quiet, scholarly heart, a foolish, tender thing had taken root. Tonight, the music was a frantic, swirling waltz. The laughter of the courtiers, sharp and brittle. It was an atmosphere of desperate gaiety, and it gave Elara the push she needed. She found him near the great obsidian throne, a goblet of the rubidark wine held loosely in one hand. He was listening to the fawning of a lesser lord, his expression one of polite, glacial disinterest. His eyes, the color of aged brandy, swept the room and, for a fleeting, heart-stopping moment, they met hers. In that glance, she saw not a king, but a man drowning in an eternity of solitude. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of bone. She moved, her borrowed slippers whispering on the polished floor. The crowd parted for her, a silent acknowledgement of her steady, determined path toward the throne. The fawning lord faltered, his words drying up as he recognized the sheer force of intent radiating from the unassuming scholar. She stopped before Kashan. She didn't curtsy. She simply looked at him, pouring every ounce of her 3 years of silent observation, of quiet empathy, of hopeless, burgeoning love, into her gaze. "Your Majesty," she began, her voice clearer than she'd expected, a small, steady flame in the cavernous hall. The music seemed to quiet, the conversations to fade into a low hum. He inclined his head, a gesture of faint curiosity. "Mistress Elara, you have left your books. A rare occasion." "They have taught me much," she said, her hands clasped before her to still their trembling. "They have taught me of history, of power, of loss. But they cannot teach me how to quiet my own heart." A flicker of something, impatience, intrigue, crossed his features. He was used to petitions, to pleas for favor, to declarations of loyalty. He was not used to this. "And what?" he asked, his voice a low, resonant murmur that vibrated in her very bones. "Does your heart have to say?" This was it. The precipice. Elara took a breath, the perfumed air tasting of ash and finality. "It says that I see you, Kashan. Not the king. Not the immortal. You. And seeing you, I have come to love you." The words hung in the air, naked and shimmering. They were a sacrifice, an offering of her most vulnerable self on the altar of his ancient ennui. The silence that followed was absolute, a held breath that encompassed the entire court. She saw the shock on the faces of the lords and ladies around them, their masks of bored amusement replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. Caitian stared at her. His ageless face, usually a study in controlled indifference, was for a moment completely blank. Then, his lips twitched. It was a small, almost imperceptible movement, but it was the beginning of the end. A low sound started in his chest, a rumble that grew into a chuckle. And then he threw his head back and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. That would have been easier to bear. A cruel laugh is a weapon, an act of aggression. This was worse. It was a laugh of pure, unadulterated amusement, of genuine surprise and condescension. It was the laugh of an adult delighting in the absurd, earnest pronouncement of a child. He was not laughing at her, he was laughing at the very idea of her love, of the monumental, preposterous folly of it all. The sound echoed in the vast hall, rich and deep and utterly devastating. It shattered the silence, and it shattered her. The court, taking its cue from its king, joined in. A ripple of tittering became a wave of polite, cutting laughter. Elara stood frozen, the blood draining from her face, leaving a cold, hollow feeling in its wake. Each peal of laughter was a physical blow, each smiling face a new shard of glass in her heart. She saw him wipe a tear of mirth from the corner of his eye, still chuckling. "My dear child," he said, his voice still thick with amusement, and the word child was the final, twisting turn of the knife. "You have a poet's heart. A touching sentiment. Perhaps you should return to your stories. Reality is less romantic." He turned away, dismissing her as one might dismiss a court jester whose joke had run its course. He gestured to a musician, and the waltz resumed, louder and more frantic than before, a tidal wave of sound to wash away her insignificant moment of humiliation. She was left standing alone, an island in a sea of swirling silks and mocking eyes. She did not cry. The tears were frozen somewhere deep inside her, a glacier of grief and shame. She felt a strange, terrifying calm descend. In the heart of that stillness, a single, cold thought took root. He laughed. He had taken the most precious thing she had to give and treated it as a jest. She turned, her back straight, and walked out of the ballroom. She did not run. She walked with the deliberate, measured pace of someone who had just made a vow. He would not be punished. He would be educated. She would make him regret that laugh, not with a dagger or with poison, but with the one thing he had so carelessly mocked. She would teach him the value of a human heart by showing him the vast, empty chasm in his own. And he would spend an eternity wishing he could fill it. The onyx spire was a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells, a place built to confound invaders and impress emissaries. For Elara, it became a sanctuary of self-imposed exile. She did not return to her modest chambers. Instead, she descended, spiraling down into the foundations of the castle, to the one place she knew she would be utterly alone, the royal archives. The archives were her domain, a sprawling, dust-choked catacomb of forgotten knowledge. Scrolls were piled in precarious towers, books lay open, their pages brittle as autumn leaves, and the air tasted of decaying paper and time itself. It was a place the immortal, forward-looking vampires of the court despised. It smelled of endings, of mortality. To Elara, it smelled like home. She lit a single candelabra, the small flames pushing back the oppressive darkness in a small, defiant circle. The shadows that danced on the towering shelves were like old ghosts, whispering secrets she was now ready to hear. Her humiliation in the ballroom felt a world away, a fever dream from another life. The raw, open wound of it had already begun to scar over, not with healing flesh, but with a cold, hard resolve that felt like obsidian forming in her veins. Revenge, she knew, was a fire that consumed the one who wielded it. What she planned was not fire. It was ice. A slow, creeping glacier of purpose that would, over years, reshape the very landscape of the king's soul. She ran a hand over the spine of a massive, leather-bound tome. The Annals of the First Bloodline. She had read it before, for pleasure, for a scholar's curiosity. Now, she would read it for ammunition. Her love had been born of seeing the man behind the crown. Her retribution would be born of understanding the crown, the kingdom, the very nature of the power he wielded. She would learn every weakness, every strength, every forgotten treaty and broken promise that underpinned his long, lonely reign. She would make herself indispensable, Not to his heart, that path was a field of ash, but to his crown. She would become the architect of his reign, the silent, unseen pillar holding up his throne. And one day, when he finally turned to see the source of his strength, he would find the woman whose love he had treated as a joke. He would see her not as a lovesick girl, but as his equal, and he would understand, with devastating clarity, what he had thrown away. The days bled into weeks, the weeks into months. The court forgot her. She became a rumor, the mad scholar in the deeps, a ghost who haunted the library. Servants left trays of food at the great iron-wrought door to the archives, and they were always empty the next morning. Sometimes they would hear the faint, dry rustle of turning pages, or see the flicker of a single candle from the grated windows high above. She grew thin, her skin taking on the pale, translucent quality of the vellum she spent her days poring over. Her eyes, once soft and brown, sharpened, gaining a new, unnerving intensity. She was no longer reading history, she was dissecting it, mapping the arteries of power, the sinews of influence. She started with trade routes, with tax law, with agricultural records from the mortal fiefdoms that paid tribute to the vampire crown. It was dry, tedious work, a penance of numbers and facts. But within the endless columns of figures, she found patterns. Inefficiencies. Apathy. The kingdom ran on the momentum of centuries, but it was a machine slowly grinding to a halt from neglect. Caitian was a brilliant strategist in war, a master of courtly intrigue, but he was bored by the mundane business of governance. And in that boredom lay her first opening. A border dispute with the goblin clans of the Wailing Mountains had been a low-grade, persistent thorn in the courtside for a century. It flared up every few decades, costing blood and resources, before settling back into a sullen truce. Caitian treated it as a nuisance, a recurring chore. Ilara, buried deep in a box of crumbling maps and property deeds from the reign of Caitian's grandfather, found the original treaty. It was written in a dialect of Old Gallic that no one at court still spoke. No one but her. She had taught it to herself from a grammar codex she'd found in her first year. The treaty was clear: a particular river, the Giltflow, had changed its course 70 years ago, shifting the border in the goblins' favor. They weren't being aggressive, they were claiming what was legally theirs by a treaty the vampire court had forgotten it had signed. She spent a week drafting a memo. She translated the relevant passages, cross-referenced them with the old maps and the new, and outlined a simple, elegant solution that would grant the goblins their rightful land while securing new mining concessions for the crown in a different area, concessions the goblins would be eager to grant in exchange for official recognition of the new border. It was a perfect, bloodless victory. Her hands trembled as she copied the final draft onto a clean sheet of parchment. This was the first stone she would cast. She could not deliver it herself. To appear before him now would be to remind him of the girl at the ball. He needed to see the work, not the woman. Not yet. She found Lord Valerus, an ancient, plodding counselor whose ambition had long ago cooled into a simple desire for a quiet life. He was a creature of pure procedure. She approached him in a dusty corridor, a wraith emerging from the shadows. He didn't even recognize her at first. "My lord," she said, her voice raspy from disuse. "I believe this may be of interest to the council. It pertains to the Wailing Mountains." She handed him the portfolio and melted back into the darkness before he could ask a single question. She knew Valerus. He would read it, see its unimpeachable logic, and, seeing no way for it to cause him trouble, he would present it as his own discovery. It was exactly what she wanted. Let another claim the credit. She was not interested in glory. She was planting a seed. From her high, grated window, a week later, she heard the proclamation. The dispute was settled. A new era of peace and trade with the mountain clans was declared. There was a feast to celebrate. Ilara did not attend. She sat in her circle of candlelight, a small, triumphant smile touching her lips for the first time in a year. The king would be pleased. He would be relieved. He would have no idea that the architect of his peace was the girl whose heart he had shattered on the floor of his ballroom. The first ripple had spread. The glacier was beginning to move. Caitian sat on his throne, the cold obsidian a familiar comfort against his back, and felt a sensation so alien he could not at first name it: boredom. The goblin dispute, which had been a reliable, low-level irritant for most of his reign, was simply gone. Lord Valerus, of all people, had unearthed some archaic treaty that had solved the entire affair with the stroke of a pen. The court praised Valerus's diligence and the king's wisdom in heeding his counsel. Caitian had accepted the praise, but a thread of dissatisfaction ran beneath it. The solution had been too neat, too perfect. Valerus, bless his desiccated soul, had never had a truly original thought in his 7 centuries of unlife. It was like watching a plough horse suddenly solve a complex equation. It was unsettling. Life in the court resumed its eternal, unchanging rhythm. The wine flowed, the music played, the sycophants whispered their poisonous flatteries. Yet, for Caitian, a subtle dissonance had crept into the familiar melody. He found his gaze sweeping the ballroom during feasts, searching for, what? A flash of twilight blue fabric. A quiet figure in the shadows, watching him with unnervingly perceptive eyes. He told himself it was absurd. The human girl, Ilara. He remembered her now, a brief, embarrassing moment at the solstice. He had been unkind. No, not unkind. He had been honest. Love was a mortal fever, a fleeting madness. He had done her a favor by cauterizing the wound before it could fester. Immortality had taught him that all passions cooled, all fires burned to ash. His laughter had been a lesson in reality. Still, her absence was a presence. A silence that drew attention to itself. He asked his chamberlain, a dry husk of a vampire named Malachi, about her. The human ward, Your Majesty. Malachi's voice was thin as cobwebs. She confines herself to the archives. Has for over a year now. They say she speaks to no 1 inch. And she is well? Caitian asked, the question sounding strangely formal in his own ears. The servants leave her food. It is taken. That is all we know. Confined to the archives. It was a fitting exile for a girl who preferred books to life. He should have been pleased. She was no longer underfoot, no longer looking at him with those tragically earnest eyes. And yet, the knowledge of her, a solitary candle burning in the deep, cold foundations of his palace, was a splinter in his mind. He dismissed it. He had kingdoms to run, alliances to maintain, an eternity to endure. A single human girl was of no consequence. 3 months later, the consequence arrived. It came in the form of the Sunstone Emissary, an envoy from the last great human kingdom in the east, a kingdom whose mags could weave sunlight into weapons. The alliance with them was ancient, fragile, and essential for keeping more aggressive supernatural rivals at bay. The emissary, a stern woman named Lady Anya, had come to renegotiate the terms of their treaty, and she had come with a grievance. She claimed the vampire crown had violated a clause in the original compact, a clause so obscure none of Caitian's advisors could even find a record of it. It concerned the magical ley lines that ran beneath both kingdoms, a shared resource. Lady Anya claimed Caitian's court mags were drawing too much power, causing magical droughts in her lands. Caitian was furious. His mags swore they were adhering to every known protocol. His counselors pored over their copies of the treaty and found nothing. Lady Anya was intractable. She produced a document, a copy of the original pact in her own language, and pointed to a passage written in a script of flowing, intricate runes. The accord of shared weave, she said, her voice cold. It stipulates that any draw upon the ley lines must be matched by a reciprocal offering of elemental energy. Your kingdom has been in deficit for 50 years. Panic, a rare and unpleasant visitor, began to coil in Caitian's gut. To admit ignorance would be a fatal show of weakness. To deny her claim without proof could lead to war. He called a recess and retreated to his private study, the emissary's ultimatum echoing in his ears: provide proof that her claim was false, or make restitution, a price that would cripple his kingdom's magical resources for a generation. He raged in the confines of his study, sweeping books and scrolls from his desk. His advisors were useless, offering only platitudes and panicked suggestions. For hours he paced, the weight of 1,000 years of kingship pressing down on him. He felt old, tired, and for the first time in a very long while, truly outmaneuvered. As dawn approached, threatening to drive him to his lightless sleep, he slumped into his chair, defeated. And there, on the one clear space on his massive mahogany desk, sat a single, slim folio bound in plain, dark leather. It hadn't been there before. He was certain of it. No servant would dare enter his study unbidden while he was in such a state. His fingers, hesitant, opened the cover. Inside, on clean, crisp parchment, was a breathtakingly elegant piece of scholarship. The first page was a perfect transcription of the runic passage from the Human Treaty, beside it a flawless translation. It was indeed the record of shared weave. His heart sank. But there was more. The following pages contained a detailed analysis, citing precedents from a dozen different magical traditions. It argued, with irrefutable logic, that the accord was not a one-sided demand. It was a symbiotic pact. The vampires drew raw power, yes, but their very nature, their connection to the earth and the night, passively infused the ley lines with a specific type of resonant, shadow-aspected energy. This shadow echo, the document argued, was the reciprocal offering. It was a form of energy the sun-wielding mags could not create but which was vital for the deep earth enchantments that protected their own borders. The final page was a summary of the court's own magical logs for the past century, cross-referenced with geological surveys from the human kingdom. It showed, with charts and figures, that during periods of high vampiric magic use, the seismic stability of the Sunstone Kingdom had increased dramatically. His kingdom hadn't been taking. It had been participating in a cycle. They hadn't been in deficit, they had been paying their debt in a currency the humans had forgotten how to value. Caitian stared at the document, his mind reeling. The scholarship was flawless, the argument airtight. It was not just a defense, it was a work of genius. It saved his kingdom. The handwriting was neat, precise, and achingly familiar. He had seen it before, on library requisitions, on catalogue notations. He picked up the folio and, for the first time in over a year, descended into the cold, silent depths of his own castle. He found her in a small, vaulted chamber at the very heart of the archives. The air was frigid, but she seemed not to notice, wrapped in a simple woolen shawl. She was surrounded by stacks of books that rose like pillars, a priestess in a temple of forgotten words. A single candle burned on her small writing desk, casting her face in a delicate dance of light and shadow. She was thinner than he remembered, and the softness of youth had been honed away, leaving behind an elegant, austere beauty, as striking and severe as a winter landscape. She looked up as he entered, her eyes showing no surprise, only a calm, quiet expectation. "You," he said, his voice hoarse. He held up the folio. "This was you." Ilara inclined her head. "I thought it might be useful." "Useful," he breathed, stepping closer. The scent of old paper and ink surrounded her like a perfume. This is masterful. This saved my kingdom from a war." "How?" "The original treaty is in the third vault," she said, her voice as calm and even as a deep pool of water. "The one whose lock was rusted shut. I found the key in a biography of your great-great-grandmother. She was apparently fond of hiding important things in her jewelry boxes. The geological surveys were misfiled under agricultural yields. It seems no one has made a proper inventory of this place in 500 years. He stood before her, the king of eternal night, the master of 1,000 legions, and he was utterly speechless. He was looking at a woman he had dismissed as a child, and seeing a mind that towered over every scholar and advisor in his court. The power she wielded was not of magic or of steel, but of knowledge, and it was a power that had just humbled him completely. "Why?" he finally managed to ask. "Why help me?" She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw no trace of the adoring girl from the solstice ball. Her gaze was cool, appraising, and held a profound, unnerving sadness. "Your kingdom's stability is in my own best interest," she said, her words precise and devoid of emotion. "My life is, after all, tied to its fate." It was a matter of simple logic. Simple logic. She spoke of saving his throne as if it were a simple academic exercise. He felt a chasm open between them, a distance far greater than the few feet that separated them. He had laughed at her heart, and in response, she had offered him her mind. It was a gift he had not earned, a rebuke so subtle and so complete that it left him breathless. He was the king, but in this cold, quiet room, surrounded by the ghosts of his own history, he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the marrow, that he was no longer the one in power. The crisis with the Sunstone emissary marked the beginning of a new era in the Court of Eternal Night, though only a handful of its residents were aware of the shift. The official narrative was that the king, in his infinite wisdom, had uncovered the hidden truths of the ancient pact. But within the highest echelons of the council, a new name was whispered, a name spoken with a mixture of awe and fear: Elara, the Archive Keeper. Caitian made her a permanent member of his advisory council. It was not a request. He had gone to the archives a second time and announced it as a royal decree, partly because he needed her, and partly to force her out of the shadows and back into the world. She had accepted with a quiet nod, her expression unreadable. To refuse a king's command would have been an act of rebellion, and her methods were far more subtle than that. So she emerged from the depths. She was given new chambers, airy and spacious, high in the spire. She was given a wardrobe befitting her new station, gowns of dark silk and velvet that made her look like a queen of winter. But she brought the scent of the archives with her, the faint, clean smell of paper and dust, a constant reminder of the source of her power. She moved through the glittering, treacherous court with a quiet, unnerving grace. She did not engage in gossip. She did not seek allies or flatter superiors. She simply did her work. And her work was changing everything. She streamlined the kingdom's tax code, doubling its revenue without placing any new burden on the mortal subjects. She rediscovered lost magical rights that strengthened the wards protecting their borders. She negotiated a trade agreement with the mercurial fae of the Gloomwood, a feat no one had managed in 3 centuries. Each success was a quiet, perfectly executed maneuver that left the court, and its king, more secure, more prosperous, and more indebted to her. Caitian found himself in a state of constant, low-grade bewilderment. He had ruled for millennia, his reign a long, unbroken line of absolute authority. Now, he felt like a figurehead. He still sat on the throne, still issued the commands, but the strategies, the solutions, the very thoughts that saved them, originated with her. They spent long hours together in the council chambers, maps and documents spread between them. The forced proximity was a unique form of torture for him. He was desperate to breach the cool, professional wall she had erected between them. He wanted to talk about that night, to exhume its corpse and try to understand the nature of his crime. Elara, he began one night, as they worked late over a series of border demarcations. The only light came from a candelabra that cast their shadows, long and distorted, against a tapestry depicting one of his ancient victories. About the solstice feast, a long time ago. You were amused, she finished for him, her eyes not leaving the map she was studying. It is of no consequence, Your Majesty. We have a potential inconsistency in the eastern patrol routes I'd like to discuss. Her voice was not cold, not angry. It was worse. It was neutral. She had taken the most humiliating moment of her life and filed it away as an irrelevant piece of data. She denied him the catharsis of an apology, the release of her anger or her tears. She simply refused to acknowledge that the girl who had offered him her heart had ever existed. He was forced to live with the memory, while she, it seemed, had moved on completely. It was a masterful, unspoken revenge, and it was working. The ghost of his laughter was becoming his constant companion. He started to watch her, truly watch her, with the same intensity she had once reserved for him. He learned the subtle language of her being. He saw the way she would press 2 fingers to her temple when deep in thought, a small, unconscious gesture of concentration. He noticed the faint scar above her left eyebrow, a tiny white line he had never seen before. He learned that she preferred tea to wine, silence to music, the stark beauty of a bare branch in winter to a rose in full bloom. He discovered that beneath her calm exterior was a formidable will, a mind that moved with the precision of a master strategist, and a quiet, unyielding integrity. He was seeing, for the first time, the woman she had been all along. The woman he had been blind to. And as he saw her, a strange and terrible thing began to happen. He began to feel. It started as respect, a grudging admiration for her intellect. But it deepened into something more complex, something that twisted in his gut with a painful, unfamiliar heat. He saw her speaking to a young mortal page, her voice gentle as she explained a point of history. He saw her stand down a belligerent, warlike general in the council, her logic so sharp and so clear that he was left sputtering and speechless. He saw her one evening on a balcony, her face turned up to the ever-present moon, and the look on her face was one of such profound, lonely contemplation that it mirrored the ache in his own chest. He was falling in love with her. The irony was so vast, so cruel, it was almost comical. He, who had laughed at the very notion of love, was now ensnared by it. And the object of his affection was a woman he had wounded so deeply she had rebuilt herself into someone who no longer needed him, or his love, in the slightest. He had taught her that love was a weakness, and she had learned the lesson all too well. She had armored her heart, and he, with his own foolish arrogance, had handed her the hammer and the forge. This realization came to a head during the affair of the Crimson Covenant. A cabal of older, more traditionalist vampires, who resented the influence of a mortal woman on their king, had plotted a coup. They believed Caitian had grown soft, that Ilara's bloodless, diplomatic solutions were a sign of weakness. They planned to assassinate her and install a more warlike king on the throne. Their plot was clever, veiled in layers of intrigue. But they made one mistake. They underestimated the woman they were trying to kill. Ilara, through her meticulous reorganization of the palace archives, had also taken control of its internal intelligence network. The letters, the coded messages, the records of secret meetings, they all passed through her domain. She uncovered the plot before it could even begin. But she did not bring it to Caitian. That would have been the simple, direct path. Instead, she laid a trap. Using her knowledge of each conspirator's vanities and weaknesses, she manipulated them, feeding them false information, turning them against one another, until their carefully constructed plot unraveled into a mess of paranoia and mutual accusation. The climax came not in a bloody battle, but in the throne room. Ilara had requested a full session of the court to discuss a matter of internal security one by one. She presented evidence. A forged letter here, a misdirected shipment of weapons there, a doctored financial ledger. She never once named the traitors. She simply laid out the facts, a web of incompetence and betrayal, and let the conspirators, in their panic to defend themselves, expose their own guilt. They fell upon each other like starving dogs, each accusing the other, revealing every detail of the plot in their desperation to save themselves. Caitian watched from his throne, speechless. She had not only protected herself and his crown, she had done it without shedding a single drop of blood, and had made his enemies dismantle themselves. It was a political masterpiece, a symphony of destruction played with whispers and parchment. When it was over, and the disgraced lords had been dragged away, the throne room was silent. The rest of the court looked at Ilara with a new, profound terror. She was no longer just the king's clever advisor. She was the most dangerous person in the kingdom. She stood before the throne, her face calm, her hands clasped. She had just saved his life, his reign, and her own, and she looked as if she had just finished cataloguing a set of books. He rose from his throne and walked down the steps toward her. The weight of his crown felt heavier than ever. He stopped in front of her, the vast, empty room their only witness. He saw her not as a subject, not as an advisor, but as the formidable, brilliant, untouchable woman she was. The chasm between them had never felt wider. "You knew," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "You knew everything, and you told me nothing." "You did not need to know," she replied, her gaze steady. "The matter is resolved." "The matter," he echoed, a raw, desperate edge to his voice. "They would have killed you, Ilara. They would have torn you apart." For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. A shadow of the memory of fear, perhaps. The outcome was never in doubt. "But you were alone in it," he insisted, taking a step closer. He wanted to reach for her, to touch her, to assure himself she was real, but he did not dare. "You faced this danger by yourself." "I have been alone for a long time, Your Majesty," she said, and her words were not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. A fact that he was responsible for. That night, sleep offered no escape. For the vampires of Caitian's court, sleep was a light, dreamless torpor, a simple resting of the body. But for him, it became a crucible. He was haunted not by nightmares, but by a single, recurring memory, the solstice ball. He saw it all in excruciating detail. The hope in Ilara's eyes, a light so pure and fragile it hurt to remember. The way her hands had trembled as she clasped them together. The sound of her voice, clear and brave, as she offered him the universe of her heart. And then he heard his own laughter. In his memory, it was no longer the sound of careless amusement. It was a monstrous thing, a sound of profound, world-breaking cruelty. It was the sound of a fool smashing a priceless jewel because he was too ignorant to know its worth. He saw the light in her eyes die, saw the color drain from her face, saw the way her shoulders stiffened as she absorbed the blow. He saw the moment the girl he had laughed at began to disappear, and the woman who now stood at his right hand began to be forged. He awoke with a silent gasp, the phantom echo of that laughter still ringing in his ears. The dawn was a pale, grey promise on the horizon, its light anathema to his kind. But he could not bear the darkness of his chambers. He went to the balcony, the cold stone biting at his bare feet. He looked out over his sleeping kingdom, a domain of shadows and secrets. He was its absolute ruler. He had everything a monarch could ever desire: power, wealth, immortality. And he was the poorest man alive. He knew what he had to do. It was not a choice. It was a compulsion, a need as profound and as urgent as his thirst for blood. He had to find her. He had to speak the words that had been choking him for months. He found her in the Royal Observatory, a glass-domed room at the very top of the spire. It was her favorite place, a room that looked out upon the endless, silent sea of stars. She was standing before the great telescope, though she wasn't looking through it. She was simply looking out, a solitary figure in the starlight. He stopped in the doorway, his heart, a thing that had not truly beaten in 1,000 years, aching with a phantom rhythm. She did not turn. She knew he was there. "The stars are beautiful, are they not?" she said, her voice soft. "They burn for millions of years, and then they die. From this distance, we can't even tell which ones are already gone." "Ilara," he said, his voice raw. He walked toward her, each step feeling like a mile across a desert of his own making. He stopped a few feet behind her. "I." The words caught in his throat. What could he say? "I'm sorry." The phrase was a pathetic, inadequate vessel for the ocean of his regret. He tried again. "That night. At the ball. I replay it, over and over. I hear myself, and I don't recognize the man who made that sound." She turned to face him then. The starlight caught in her eyes, making them glitter like chips of obsidian. Her expression was not harsh, but it was profoundly weary. "You do not recognize him? He is you, Caitian. A you that was careless. A you that was blind. A you that did not know the value of a thing freely offered." "I was a fool," he whispered, the admission tearing from him. "I was arrogant. And I was afraid. Of a feeling I had buried centuries ago. I saw your heart, so open and so brave, and I laughed because I could not bear the sight of it. It was a reflection of my own emptiness. My own cowardice." He took another step, closing the distance between them until he could feel the faint warmth of her body, a startling contrast to his own deathly chill. He looked down at his hands, then back up at her face. "I have spent the past year watching you," he said, his voice breaking. "Watching you save my kingdom. Watching you command the respect of monsters and lords. Watching you be brilliant, and strong, and kind. And I have fallen in love with you, Ilara. I love the woman you are, and I am haunted by the girl I was too blind to see. My laughter, it is the greatest regret of my eternal life." There it was. The truth, laid bare between them, just as her truth had once been laid before him. The cycle was complete. The power dynamic had not just shifted, it had inverted entirely. He stood before her, the king of eternal night, as vulnerable and as hopeful as she had once been. He had confessed. He was offering her his heart. And now, he waited for her response, bracing himself for the killing blow, her laughter. Ilara looked at the king, this ancient, powerful creature laid bare before her. She saw the truth of his words in his eyes, in the raw pain etched onto his face. The great King Caitian, who had commanded armies and built empires, was trembling. He was offering her the very thing she had once pleaded for, the thing he had mocked. Victory. This was the moment she had worked for, the culmination of her cold, meticulous plan. Her revenge was complete. And she felt nothing. No triumph. No satisfaction. Only a vast, hollow sadness. She had set out to teach him a lesson, to force him to see her, to understand the weight of what he had discarded. She had succeeded beyond her wildest imaginings. He saw her now. He understood. But the woman he saw, the woman he now loved, was a fortress she had built around the ruins of a broken heart. He was in love with her armor. She did not laugh. The thought was abhorrent. To inflict that same wound upon him would make her no better than the man he had been. It would be a betrayal of the very principle she had sought to teach him, that a heart is not a toy. You laughed because you did not understand, she said, her voice quiet, but each word landing with the weight of a stone. You saw a child's infatuation. You did not see an offering of trust. It was a thing of great value, and you treated it as a trifle. I know, he breathed, his gaze desperate. Let me spend the rest of my life making it right. Let me show you. Show me what? She interrupted, not unkindly. That you can love me now that I am powerful. Now that I am useful to you. The girl you laughed at had nothing to offer you but her heart, Cation. And you found it worthless. I had to make myself into this, she gestured vaguely to herself, to the fine gown, to the room that symbolized her power, for you to finally see me. The truth of her words struck him like a physical blow. He flinched. She was right. He had fallen for the strategist, the counselor, the savior of his kingdom. Would he have seen the scholar, the quiet girl in the library, if she hadn't forced him to? He could not honestly answer yes. His regret deepened, becoming a bottomless well of self-loathing. The question, Elara continued, her voice softening slightly as she saw the utter devastation on his face, is not whether I can forgive you. Forgiveness is a simple thing, a balm for the forgiver. The past cannot be unwritten. Your laughter will always be a part of our story. She paused, looking out at the distant, dying stars. The real question is, what will you do now that you know the value of what you broke? My revenge was never about hurting you. It was about forcing you to grow. To become a man capable of seeing the heart of another, not just its utility. I have done that. The rest, she turned her gaze back to him, her eyes clear and deep, is up to you. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She did not fall into his arms, nor did she turn her back on him. She simply stood her ground, the architect of his enlightenment, and left the next move, the next century of moves, in his hands. She had opened the door for him, but he would have to learn how to walk through it. He would have to earn not her love, but her trust. And he understood, with a clarity that was both terrifying and liberating, that this would be the great work of his eternal life. He would spend the rest of his days trying to prove he was a man worthy not of the powerful woman who stood before him, but of the brave girl he had once so carelessly destroyed. His regret would be his constant companion, his eternal penance. Not a punishment inflicted by her, but a self-imposed reminder of his failure, a catalyst for his transformation. She had made sure he would regret his laughter forever, not by cursing him with pain, but by blessing him with the agonizing, beautiful, impossible hope of one day becoming a man who was worthy of her love. It was a far more profound, and a far more permanent, revenge than any she could have imagined in the beginning. It was the beginning of his humanity.